Gender, Migration, and Work, Filipino Health Professionals in the U.S. by Yen Le Espiritu. A critical transnational perspective to migration studies. If you look at the Philippines, they've had a very intense history of colonization. They had the Spanish colonization for hundreds of years from 1565 to 1898. They had the US colonization from 1898 to 1946. Then they had the independence of 1946 to 1965. And then we had Marcos, who again was a very reviled president that people have alleged to take out a lot of money from the country, as well as now currently we have President Duterte, who is under a lot of opinions on how he runs his country right now. I invite you to Google him. Because of the economic issues, there has been a lot of transnationalism, which means a lot of Filipinos have moved around to different countries to support themselves. Why do Filipinos migrate to the US? Well, Espiritu says we should actually look at the unequal links between the third world and the first world. For instance, today's global world is not just some glorious hybrid complex entity. It is a systematically divided and produced world, page 238. Now, we had prior flows of American and Spanish goods, army, capital, and culture, and it displaced a lot of Filipinos. And actually, it spurred a lot of migrations of Filipinos into the United States. When the US was colonizing the Philippines, they imposed English. They put in an English educational system. They Americanized many, quote unquote, Filipino values and aspirations. So under US occupation, they transformed the schools and hospitals to be American-led and run. Now, Edna Bonacich and Lucie Cheng, and I'm actually a student of Edna Bonacich, make a very great argument, actually very controversial. So I'm going to read it slowly, and I invite you to pause the screen. Pre-World War II immigration of Asians has to be understood in the development of capitalism in Europe and the United States, and the emergence of imperialism, especially in relation to Asia. From World War II onward, as the world economy has become more globally integrated, Asia has become the site of US expansion. As a result, contemporary immigrants from the Philippines, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia came from countries severely disrupted by US colonialism, war, and neocolonialism. So I want you to pause the screen and I want you to think about that quote and what does it mean? Because it's explosive. Especially if you're from these countries. If you're from the Philippines, South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia, you're here because of US colonialism, war, and neocolonialism. Now, one of the shocking things about Filipinos is if you look at the 1904 World Fair Bazaar, Filipinos or Asians, remember a lot of people can't distinguish Asians from other Asians, were actually exhibited during the 1904 World Fair. This is an advertisement for human exhibits of the Philippine Islands in the World Fair in St. Louis in 1904. Over 1,000 Filipinos were displayed. And this is, horrendously racist. And they actually displayed other ethnic groups as well. And one of the, looking at Asians, Filipinos was a group that they displayed where people just looked at them like they're animals. And again, they were displayed like this and very shocking to the modern eyes. And, there were people who died coming to being displayed here, and then they just, buried their bodies. But again, this was horrendous, but also many scholars talk about how this is a show of imperialism. Now, this links very much with Espiritu's argument, and also a great book that I would love for you to read by Catherine Choi. She's actually a professor at Berkeley, and she looks at her great book. It's called Empire of Care. It looks at nursing and migration of Filipino Americans into the United States. This is a great book. Please buy it, especially if you're a nursing student. So if this U.S. colonialism, labor recruitment, and the production of Filipino nurse migrants, Choi argues that nurses came to the U.S. because of a prior colonization where the U.S. wanted to, quote, civilize and, quote, sanitize the Filipino body. Scientific papers were published at this time that said Filipino bodies were carriers of foreign antibodies and germs, and very much the quote yellow peril, right? And again, does this remind you of COVID-19 and the over 3,000 racist attacks against Asians in the United States, but also globally? You see this trope of Asian Americans being holders of disease has been around for hundreds of years. Gender and migration, the formation of a gendered labor force. Philippines sent many nurses to study in the USA exchange program. 1965, many of these exchange students stayed in the United States. So after they exchanged to become trained as nurses, to actually train to become nurses in the Philippines, they actually, because of 1965, which was fought for by African American civil rights activists such as Dr. Martin King and Malcolm X, they fought for equal immigration policies, and which enacted the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which enabled all these Asians to come into the United States. Negotiating changing generals and the migration of married women. So mostly women actually were in the exchange student for nurses, and they migrated with their family. And again, this changed the constitution and the dynamics of Filipino American families. Great books I want to recommend are these books. And I hope you learned something about Filipino migration.